curious minds. I was listening to the conversation at my table. I mean, on what my bias is, let's put a man and a woman on the moon, right? And let's really define what that looks like in education. I'm so about the tweaking and the innovations we do, the small innovations that don't require a very expensive rocket ship, right? But those things that we can do. I also see how in education, if somebody gives you a $100 reward, you're not going to, I don't know any teacher that, at least that I've talked to here, and certainly not at our table, that's going to take that $100 and put it in their pocket. They're going to go buy a pizza for their class, right? So, what we already have is that ethos of abundance. You have it, we share it, there'll be more coming, right? But how do we really infuse it, And for me, I think the big thing is really about, do you know WD-40? Some of you. Does everybody have WD-40 in there? Okay. Do you know what it stands for? There you go. So I want the WD-40 award in education. And here's what that means. So WD stands for water displacement. And it was what they developed, and I think it was in the 40s or 50s, a way to displace water, and I believe it was used for aircraft, for engines and things like that, right? And the 40 is they got it right on the 40th try. So they basically celebrated 39 failures within their name. They embedded it right in their name, right? So what is the WD-40 award in education? And what that would mean is we want to know failure 1, failure 2, failure 3, right? Do we do that? Heck no. You get a grant to do X. Oh, let me tell you how it was successful. Oh, they had this little problem, but what does that really look like, right? And it's very risky to have a failure in education because I'll look bad because I failed, and then my program officer will look bad because they funded a bad grant, and then they'll look bad to their, right? There's this whole chain, there's this whole cycle that I just feel like we have to just rapid prototype a couple of different examples. Maybe if we do it and see that nothing bad happens, then maybe it will just really spur that kind of innovation on. Because I think when I look at the presentations last night, we were remarking how similarly themed they are. I think we get what needs to happen next. And how do we just not come here, year after year and just do that same skit?
Okay, how about a couple of ideas? First one has to do with stock option. For example, what if the school district set aside, let's say $100,000, okay, into a portfolio, Vanguard, Fidelity, what have you, and give exemplary teachers, staff, and students certain amount of stocks. Let's say you earn 2 stocks, you earn 3 stocks. And it's part of a staff or school-wide or district-wide financial literacy course too, okay? So you manage it yourself. So the group will say, okay, if I earn so many stocks, well, we'll sit together and figure out what would be the allocation ratio. Stocks, bonds, fixed, international, small cap. But anyway, all of those be a nice exercise. But together, that portfolio get invested, and you can cash out your stock option. If it's $100, hopefully it'll be 110, 120. And over time, with the scale, it can grow to be quite a bit, and the students may be able to, over time, be able to use part of that for tuition, okay? And that is, I know my friends talk about 401k, but this is a little bit tweak from that. Because you want the teamwork. It's not individualized. It's a whole team. It's a team portfolio, team stock option. Then another idea is when I saw this road trip with the kids, and we have done it, when we finally won the National Blue Ribbon Award, because the whole school said, we're going to win the National Blue Ribbon, and we won it. And instead of 3 of us going to Washington, D.C. to receive the award from the Clintons, we sent back the flyer, say, we're not going to send 3 names. Non-applicable, see the attached list. We attached 186. And 186 of us did go. Okay? Custodian, children, parents. So anyway, this entire road trip, from the money, all the resources, everybody, 4 days together in Washington, D.C., 6 a.m. in front of the White House, after a red eye out of inner city. That really built the momentum and the entire teamwork. And with that, 4 years later, 86 of us went to China. Nobody go or everybody go. So the next step may be figure out some kind of incentive that all of us will go to the moon. That's quite a trip, huh? Okay. Just a thought.
As usual, it's really difficult to follow Yvonne. Where are the other people for these chairs? We've all got big ideas. We need to have more people up here. Good, at least there's one more. I'm Liza Loop, and I was, I guess I'm modern because I was doing convergent production and trying to follow the rules, and after all, she said we were supposed to think about a prize. So I was thinking about a prize I was thinking about a prize for an individual. And money is really nice and really enabling, but in my life, and also I've heard here in the social justice conversations that power is also a real prize that people will work for. But also, we don't know who's going to receive this prize ahead, so we need to individualize the prize in some sense. It can't be one thing that's going to fit everybody. So thinking along those lines, I think that if we had just giving an individual money is nice, the sort of the Nobel Prize. It's nice to get that money and then you can go and do your work. So being able to, say, have a year's sabbatical, paid sabbatical, that you could do what you want with, should be part of the prize of a person who had somehow done a huge amount for education. But usually the people who are doing that sort of innovative work are interested in spreading it. So I think that along with having a year's sabbatical that you win, you should also win the power to advise a major fund and be able to choose who receives the money. So that way you would end up having the option of spending your year with a staff that would help you explore other innovations. And I'm talking about a fund of $1 million or $10 million, not, 100,000. So that you end up with power to spread the innovation and the spirit that you want. So I'm seeing a sort of a Nobel Prize, and this is the combination of the three of us at our table talking. It got expanded from what each of us came up with. So we're talking about an individual receiving the Educational X Prize. They get a year's sabbatical, and they get a position in a major fund so that they can evaluate and determine what other educational activities get funded. They could fund whatever they were working on that they got the prize from. They could fund 100 other seed projects. They could pick one or two and really scale and spread their own spirit.
So in full disclosure, I've just made a slight error, and it's all about design. So I'm going to fix it. Maybe you guys can help me. What this really is meant to be is a conversation among the people up here. And I realized I set it up not exactly right, and so then it just seemed like each of us were presenting our ideas. I did it first, by mistake. So no, because I think you were finished. But my point is, you're really having a conversation here that we're witnessing. That's why it's called Fishbowl. So actually, I sat here and sort of presented it out all to you, but really you're talking to each other, which is why I said it's so lonely. So here, just to start, I'm not going to say anything, but just so you don't have to look across an empty who's. So the idea is that we're up here having a conversation. conversation, and when people get excited about the conversation, they'll come in. But we're talking to each other, not to them. They're not
Okay,
there.
all right. So actually, I just want to build on, sorry, I'm Simon Buckinghamshire from the Open University in the UK. I just want to build on actually the last thing that was said on how you sustain this and embed real innovation. Because one thing we talked about in our table was the problem of things burning brightly but very briefly and then dwindling out. And in the UK, and I gather elsewhere, we've managed to export the program What Not to Wear. And one thing we're trying to do is put new clothes on here. And what Trini and Susanna, the fashion gurus, do, of course, is sometimes they sneak back on their special cases a year after the program or something and throw open the wardrobe and see what clothes they're still choosing to wear. And sometimes the people are very embarrassed because they've actually gone back to choosing the jogging pants and the sweat top and all those great clothes, and the whole new identity that they got on for the program has somehow evaporated as real life set back in again. So that's something that we need to do, is actually follow through programs 1 year, 2 years, 3 years to see how the initial concept changed when it actually got embedded. So the prize that I would like to inaugurate is the Which Way is Up award, because it seems to me that everybody here is saying the current measure of which way is up, whether we're measuring teacher effectiveness or schools or what it means to learn, is all back to front and upside down and no longer fit for purpose. And many of us, and we saw last night, have all sorts of measures and new ways of defining which way is up when we want to talk about students really learning what's important. But we have to have ways of assessing and tracking and doing that in a rigorous way, or it turns out to be more hand-waving, and these people are just interested in sort of soft, fuzzy skills which are impossible to assess and track. So we have to actually ground the new definition of up and develop ways of doing that. And I'd like to see an award for people who are actually able to do that and show that they can track a student and say, we're trying to stretch the student in this way because we have a language for talking about these new things, these new ways of defining up.
Yes, and I like saying that. Last night at the bar, I was privileged to talk to a woman who's been working in Baghdad, taking a few months off to come back, and there's like a 3-month on, 3-month off period or something like that. And one of the things she said was, if you give somebody something, they don't cherish it as much as if they earned it themselves. And so I was listening to him and I was thinking, well, data's kind of like that, right? I mean, we just give our communities data. We give it to them. Here, these are some numbers. Here's some information. Do something with it. But we don't allow them to earn it, right? We don't make the indicators theirs. Here are the indicators you decided you wanted, and you measure them. And when you get the results you want, you know where you are and you can target where you want to go. Instead, we have somebody, what we like to call with a long head, comes in and tells them, here's the numbers and this is what it means, and you people make sure that you follow what we do. So along those lines, in terms of giving it, making them earn it and not giving it to them, how about a prize where you take a group of students and a teacher, kind of like the solar car thing, and you just say, build a school from the ground up. Design it, find the people you need, find the resources, who's it going to serve, where's it going to sit, how are you going to site it, is it green, is it not green, what are going to be, and as they go through the process, they'll learn 1,000 times more than what they would have learned in a classroom. And at the end of the year, you could take it, they could go somewhere nationally, and they could have a big competition where they present, and the winner actually gets to build their school where they cited it, and you do it year after year. And that way, it started at the ground, they have their own indicators, everything's there, and that was my thought. Thank you. Who's next?
So thanks. I mean, I want to ask you something though about that, because one of the common themes across, I think, this conference is this capacity to communicate and integrate information in ways that we don't do now. And that's technically hard. I saw The Matrix, and that ended up having a big influence on my life because what I really liked about that was the pilots staring at the screen of numbers flowing up and down, and they were able to capture the diversity of life numerically. And so being a background in psychometrics, I feel like that infrastructure is not established yet in education. We don't have a way of knowing whether we're moving the dial or we're falling back when we have these innovations. And so to find which way's up, I think we need a new way of communicating, much like the internet. We have HTML, we have XML, we have codified conventions and language. We need a data model that can be nimble to every educational assessment that ever happens anywhere, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in the community, but every competency assessment that ever occurs should matter, and we should care enough to build a model that's nimble to those bits of information that tell us about who a person is and what they can do and what their potential is and how they can contribute. So, thanks.
So I would build on that, Jeff. I mean, I like what I heard in what you're saying is defining really clear criteria for what a solution needs to be, but not necessarily dictating how to get there. And I think that to me is the power of prizes, is to be solution agnostic, but very specific about the problem being solved, and to harness energy that already exists and focus it, right? So we all would say, yeah, we need that, right? But like bits and pieces of people are working on it, but together we're not pointing in the same direction. So I think prizes and incentive have the benefit of being a point in the right direction. And the best prize is one that everybody says, of course, we all agree we want that, right? But we just never knew we could get there and create the focus. So I just thought a couple ideas that I would say would be great solutions to have if we could. So one would be, and I think the last thing I would say is that it has to be scalable too. Right? I think, how do we think about that? That's one of our criteria. So one idea is, how do we create a $100 summer solution that helps students who graduate high school avoid remediation in college? It has to be easy. If we could do it for $100, what would that look like? Another would be, how do we teach the tens of millions of people who are English language learners in this country? There's only 1 million or less who are in informal ESL programs. So how do you do it cheaply, mobily, engaging, that start to bring them into a learning process? And I feel like there's a bunch of those things where you could say, wouldn't it be nice if? And some of them we might feel like there's enough energy and capacity to find criteria around them.
In our county, we serve about 80,000 students here, and we already have an award system that basically we reward on a rubric for about 5 different things, of which scalability is one, accountability is another, innovativeness is a third, creativity, 4 or 5 things. And our issue is we award these things and then we can't broadcast them. We can't take them to the next level. We can't share them. We can't take them and help the best ideas go forward for lack of resources. So we already have in education, in some contexts, some of these systems that are about the things we're talking about. And we go in, we get all excited about these things. And we'd love to share them. Taking it that next level sometimes would be just maybe not necessarily revolutionary, but evolutionary, in a way that people are talking about it, and we're rewarding our teachers in an award ceremony, and they all really love being recognized for the things they've done. I'd love to take it the next level, which would be whether it's countywide, and beyond that at the state level, you have those kinds of things. So you're talking suddenly scaling from a school of 300 to 500 to 80,000 to really 1 million, and it can be done in a 2-step process.
A couple of things we were talking about in our table in relationship to both of what I think you're saying is that it's important to, it sounds like you're talking about prizes that are individual ones that you want to scale up. You're talking about a significant, a prize with a substantial buy-in that teachers would recognize as a goal they were already working toward, with some substantial funding behind it that might be able to scale.
Just clarification, not individual. Clarification, since you mentioned that this was an individual, it's actually school-wide goals for rewarding, as you're saying, graduation for whole groups of students that were otherwise not. So we're talking ideas as opposed to individuals.
Sure, but it's still within one district. And when he's talking about, I think, is trying to move it beyond one district and trying to, if it's an idea that teachers can latch on to, you don't want to create a prize that you're trying to create motivation. No, that's not what you're talking about. You're trying about a prize that already you have motivation for and buy-in for, and you want to try to create incentives. And what teachers need along the way are the ways to get to that prize, and making sure that through OER Commons, through other kinds of means, district professional development, that it isn't just an individual event, but something that you work towards over time.
I will heartily agree, because that's exactly what I'm talking about as well. Yeah, yeah.
I want to turn the tables just for a minute. I was kind of had a breakthrough moment at the first event that on the first day of this fest, and it's nice to be able to return to it a little bit now, is that in terms of incentivizing, I'd like to see a way to incentivize legislatures. How can we turn the tables? They've been talking about incentivizing teachers or trying to create performance mechanisms, which I think are useful, and I think there are a lot of reasons to look in those directions. But how can we turn considering, particularly in California right now, with the legislature at such loggerheads and unable to really meet the needs of the population, if we were to relax term limits for if the legislature meets a certain number of goals, like suppose that they were to pass a budget on time, then during the next for 2 years in a row, then during the next year they would the term limits would be relaxed for them. They would be able to run again. They were a legislature that has shown they can work together, and they go back and get voted upon. It would be a citizens' referendum to be able to do something like that. And the question is, what other kinds of goals that are broad enough that that we could try to hold legislators to, and which would show that the legislature is actually working together to meet the needs of California, such as equitable funding across districts. If you have some kind of stable base where you know what the funding is coming from, and that it comes at in a way that school districts can plan on, then they can move forward with the innovation that's needed.
I don't have a prize or a name of it or whatever, but I wanted to pick up on the challenge of motivating policymakers to make change. What I see a lot is that the role of policy is setting regulation that really constrains innovation. And the way that we get around it is we write waivers to those policies. But we sort of need a new generation of policy where the waiver is the policy, and the policy is, and I'm not a libertarian, so I know that the public wants controls over certain kinds of things. But we need to develop incentives or prizes for policymakers, presidential medal or something like that, where we start to change the fundamental way that the system is designed. And it has to do, every policy, every issue that we've been talking about has a policy constraint to it. If you talk about the hours the hours in a school day that a student needs to be in the classroom, prohibits a lot of the experiential learning, and the states and districts that do that have to go out and create new policies for that. But so we have to have a fundamental way of rethinking this. And one of the things I would think of doing is to have to have policymakers meet and talk about what a new generation of policy might look like that would encourage this kind of change.
I just want to put in a plug for an organization that I'm working with, which is the John Vasconcellos Legacy Project, and we are literally working on these issues. The 3 projects that we're doing are, one is the Capital Collaboration Project, which brings former legislators together with incoming junior legislators and mentors them, so that instead of when they term out, having just barely graduated from legislature school so they know the ropes, they have the advantage of the folks who've been there for years and they can ask questions, and we're doing it very informally with personal meetings and dinners together, and so that they establish personal relationships and they can call each other up. The new legislators can call up the former legislators and say, I want to do this, how the hell do I get it through? And what was your experience with it? So that's education on a peer-to-peer education on a very senior level. We're also working on the higher education plan, which should have been rewritten already and hasn't been. But the thing that I'm interested in working on, we're going to be working in a local school district to try and be one of hundreds of nonprofits that address the achievement, the Latino Black achievement gap, the gap between that ethnic group and the Asian and white ethnic group. And my particular, one of the particular things that I'm interested in doing is to go do community organizing in the school district, going family to family and encouraging both the students and the parents to learn about civic engagement. In a sense, we're a democracy. We already have the policy or the basic idea that those legislators in our capitals are supposed to be there representing the people. What we have is a disconnect where the people give up their power, and the schools are not turning out people who are taking back their power. So if we can increase the civic engagement through the schools and through the school outreach into the communities, we can do a tremendous amount to change those policies. If the legislators don't respond to what those civically engaged voters want, we're going to kick the bums out.
Is that me? So actually my comment follows, I think, fairly nicely on that. One of the things that's become clear to me in this meeting is I'm starting to think differently about data and outcomes. They're not always the same thing. And I think outcomes in education could be defined as students achieving, or people really, achieving some level of educational attainment. So some place they want to go, did they get there or not? And if you start thinking about that, then you say, okay, well, how would you do that? Who's responsible for that? And something that hasn't been sort of broadened up here yet is this idea that we're not just incentivizing teachers, we should be incentivizing attaining that goal. And it occurred to me, I haven't been to a whole lot of conferences where you see awards being handed out where, for example, maybe a parent is brought up on the stage and awarded in front of a whole pool of teachers for being a really excellent mentor and incentivizer to getting their kids, or maybe any kid, to actually achieve that goal. And so maybe the incentives become something that we distribute more broadly to the whole community. We include administrators, we include local peers, teachers, parents, whomever, and they're all kind of seeing each other as being co-conspirators in this effort to actually get people to wherever it is we determine they would like to go. That's it.
I was thinking of rewards and incentives on a classroom level, and one of the issues teachers run into is when they are leaving their classroom for a day or two, they do not know who will be substituting. The substitute has little connection often with the school and just comes in, tries to follow the lessons, etc. Well, what if teachers are rewarded for creating open source materials, posting them, etc., with a sabbatical day or two mid-year that they get to choose? And instead of just having any substitute come in, have someone from the district office or the school board, etc., team with a parent volunteer, come in the day before they're leaving on sabbatical, find out what's happening in the classroom so they can better prepare for a 1 or 2 day sabbatical time for that teacher, because sometimes teachers just need times to think and process and to step away and say, now I know what I can do better. And so building that whole concept of a small sabbatical time in with the idea that you have to have a flow when you bring in a substitute would be incentive for some teachers, because they can only be gone so long. They understand that. They don't want to leave their students in the lurch when you really don't know who's coming into your classroom?
I'm thinking these have been some great ideas. And I also want to think about sort of provoking the public and educators in a way that we haven't been provoked before. You know, I think everybody in the room works in education in one way or another. You know, education is such a dirty word, right? Like when we were even planning this conference, people were saying to us, oh, don't say about making education relevant. It's about learning and it's about schools. And here's why, you know, we were sort of really pushing education, making education relevant. And I'll tell you what this has to do with prizes in a second, is that it really, if you think about the function of educating and what that means, that really was what we were talking about trying to make relevant. Like we know in a lot of ways how to make learning relevant already. We know, you know, how to take a small child and, you know, put them on the stool and have them stir what you're cooking, and then they learn about the heat and the temperature and we know learning. We know something about learning, right? But we really are, you know, we don't know what we need to know about educating yet. And so I really would just, and I don't have the answers by any means, but I'd like to just totally like push that idea of really what it means. And is part of the problem, the fact that education is in so many ways portrayed in such a bad light. I mean, not that we haven't earned it, right? I mean, I know that the students from South San Francisco High are gone today, but, you know, the fact of how boring we know school is, and we had, I forgot who it was some local superintendent in the last few years, you know, schooling doesn't need to be fun. Kids need to work hard, and that's the problem. And I think we are just hearing that resoundingly, like, not true. What are those incentives? I mean, is there something, do we have to frame sort of the education piece first before we can really give the incentive, you know, or the prize to say, you know, let's do it differently?
So it's just occurred to me listening to you. My 5-year-old's pretty smart, and I think he could earn a PhD tomorrow. Is there any reason why that's not possible? Like, what is it about how we define education and educational attainment that makes probably most people say, whoa, you know, like 5-year-olds and PhDs, that's just completely unacceptable. And why? What's happening in the process of getting that degree that makes us say that that's not correct? Because if it's just knowledge, there's every reason to believe that people who really spend a lot of time and effort could actually get a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old, maybe not a PhD, but maybe a high school diploma, maybe, you know, are they going to pass out of 5th grade? I mean, anyway,
Yeah, and that's why I'm so interested in this X Prize idea. Do people know what the X Prize in education, what the X Prize is? You know, it's a prize that's been used mostly in science and technology and engineering. You know, how do you build a better engine faster? How do you get to the moon with less energy, right? It's very measurable. You know, it's very easy to see what that thing is, right? Because the measurement of something, because everybody says, well, how do you measure a prize? Is it just a lottery or is there really an outcome, right? And so the reason why I like it is because it's just totally big and bold, and it gets people who ordinarily might not necessarily get engaged say, oh, I think we can do that. And that's what I love about the idea of an X Prize like that, because it really gets people just thinking about what's possible in a way that I'm not sure some of the other things, many of the suggestions have been great, and there's some that are pretty radical, like I love the legislator, how we could, that's certainly a reward and incentive. But how do we, I think if we can kind of crack that in a bigger way, then some of those smaller impact ones will have much larger impact.
So I was going to respond around the X Prize idea, and actually to Yvonne's earlier comments, trying to get her back in, but I was afraid this was going to wrap up. So I can either wait until she... Okay, we'll just go into it. We at our table were actually talking about individual learning accounts, and also at the macro level, at the government level. And what was really grabbing about Yvonne's idea is that she based it in a community. And I thought what would be really neat is if we had innovation funds that we went to learning communities such as schools, and if you started with a basic investment, say $50,000 or $100,000, and you're asked the community to invest in themselves. And so I think this addresses Michael's point about you have to kind of try and earn it yourself. So if you start with a community investment and then you put it in an X Prize scenario and you say if you actually take I say, well, it'd be a little different because I think X Prize kind of has a final window. But if you say to build momentum at 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, to really highlight the long-term investment that you want to see on the payoff, you want to look at some form, and this is the trickier part, as some form of social return on investment. So whether you look at, I think Yvonne was looking at more of a financial return on an account through stock options, and that might be one way to look at it, but you might ask each community to justify or prove out their social return on investment and what that was, and the payoff would ideally be something that is, I would say, a percentage of the investment, a percentage of the payoff would actually be a return on the investment that would be some interesting, I think the X Prize is usually $10 million, so you know, if you give $100,000 to a school in some form and you return $1 million, that's a pretty good return. And then you give the $9 million, say, to the school or learning community of choice as a return, as a community investment return, so maybe to their social investment of choice. So that's an idea I tried to, Yvonne's entered now, so. That's kind of an idea that I thought was triggered by what she was saying, to really think about how could we think about innovation funds for learning communities such as schools, and that allows them the flexibility of thinking about how to innovate themselves into social return on investment. So I'd love to hear thoughts.
Well, my thought doesn't follow on this, so we'll have to pick yours up in a minute. My thought follows on what you said about your 5-year-old and what Shep said about incentivizing policymakers. It seems to me that if we look over the latter part of the 20th century at all the liberation movements that we had, the one that we have not had is kids' liberation. Kids are still subject to policymakers in Washington, teachers, parents, and so on. Of course, some of that has to be because in many cases they don't make wise decisions. But in other cases, they may. And, you know, when do you stop being a kid who can't make any decisions and be an adult? Well, the law says 18. But I think that we ought to give a prize for putting together kids with legislators. When I think about No Child Left Behind, and I think what the motivation of the legislators were in passing that law, I see two things. One is it was cheap. It's far cheaper to test than to actually do some reform of education. So the model was really an economic model. You put out the test, and everybody tries to meet the test, and so you incentivize them to do well in school, you know, by having this test over there. So nobody looked at the unintended consequences of those tests, and we heard a little bit about that from Joel Westheimer, but there are many others. They're very inequitable. The kids that they were ostensibly designed to help, minority kids, are doing worse now than before those tests were in place. And I think the legislators were punitive. They said, oh, these kids are not doing well. How are we going to get them to do well? We got to get them to work hard. We got to get them to meet these tests. Come on, stop fooling around in school and start working hard. And, you know, I don't know what kids they had in mind when they were passing these laws, but it wasn't the kids that they were designed to help. So I would like to see legislators actually get in touch with some of their constituents who are kids, not the parents and not the teachers and not the school administrators. And let's promote a little kids' liberation here.
I think in a lot of ways kids are liberating themselves online. And they're doing it because they can do what they want without us getting in their way, right? They can create their own world, and they do. You know, your 5-year-old or your 6-year-old is probably going to have his PhD in World of Warcraft soon enough, right? And from I mean, I grew up geek, right? I'm probably one of the first kids from a generation that legitimately grew up geek. I remember my dad bringing home an Epson QX10 running CP/M, and because of it, I was programming Pascal at 13 years old, right? Because it was fun. It was the only fun thing I had to do in Zebulon, North Carolina, dear God. And there wasn't anything at school that was anywhere close to that, right? And I think increasingly, kids that grow up geek, and there's a lot of them, and that can be very broadly defined now. You know, every kid every kid I've ever met in the last, everyone who's a kid now has as much geek cred as I did, just because that's the world they live in now. And my natural inclination is to figure out how to take advantage of that. And where is the award? So this is a big radical idea, and one that a lot of people may not agree with. But I want an award for someone who sets up an immersive environment that allows kids to learn the things they would have learned in school, but never having to go to school and never having to have a teacher tell them what to do, right? That's the award I want to see. I want to see an award for the people who create the World of Warcraft for English literature, right? I want to know what the guild looks like, where you have to know about Beowulf and Weregild in order to to go bring Grendel down, right? And those things are out there, right? I don't know if any of you ever played the game Civilization, right? So my 11-year-old nephew is like a resource for his teacher in the World Civilizations class, because that kid knows more about world civilizations than that teacher does, because he plays Civilization for hours and hours and hours a day, right? And his parents said, "You stop playing that ridiculous video game." "Oh, wait, you're teaching your class? Well, I guess we can't say that you can't play that game now, because now he's playing it in class," right? And all I know is that looks an awful lot like an opportunity to be leveraged to me. The X Prize gives you a prize for working around an entire infrastructure, right? The X Prize for space is not, how do you make NASA work more efficiently? The X Prize is, how do you make NASA irrelevant so that we can move past that? And if we've got a whole bunch of teachers, who are, the engineers who work at NASA are going to be very nervous about participating in the X Prize. And that's one of the things that I think about and worry how it is that we take all of these people who have all of this knowledge and maybe what is the way to incent them properly to help make themselves irrelevant in their current form so that they can move on to a higher purpose, maybe. That's what I wonder.
I started to wake up when I heard the word kid liberation, and I was just thinking about it's no reflection on the previous speakers, but I was starting to drift. But I read an article by David Rock in Psychology Today, and the headline was something like the average student in high school has less autonomy than that of a convicted felon in prison. And autonomy is one of his themes in terms of what's important for people to function well on the job, let alone for survival, let alone on the job. So I was thinking that maybe an award to incentivize teachers to get their kids to be more autonomous, to have a feeling of value to connect with what was said before about getting the kids together with the legislators. If there's an intermediary, like a teacher who could set that up, the kid would have more of a feeling of value, autonomy, power, and so on. And that's been done with homeless people, actually. In Minnesota, there's a fellow named Lauren Nemi who's an organizer. They have workshops where homeless people meet with legislators, and they talk about, homeless people are the most powerless next to high school kids, I guess. At least they have their shopping carts and, all the cliches. But if people who do give kids an opportunity to do that kind of thing and to become self-empowered should be given guerdon, meaning that's from Beowulf, reward, riches, glory, that kind of thing.
That was
Thank you.
I was just thinking what you said about the specificity of the X Prize and how it really does need to get to a specific outcome. And it's interesting because we talked again in our group about that. About it becomes very subjective in education because it's how you define success. I mean, going out to the moon is certainly very clear that you're going to land on the moon. And you can certainly talk about tests, but nobody wants to go there either. But I went to the idea of community because I feel like that is where the greatest impact could be. And I want to challenge people to think about how could you look at a community's equivalent of landing on the moon? Because I think it's really hard to do it specifically at a learner level. And I think we almost kind of get too siloed almost. But if we look at it systemically at a community, I think there's a way to do that, and I think that's what we're missing. Now, I don't have the answer for what that return on investment is, but I really do think that that's the moon that we have to shoot for.
My sort of thinking comes from my European background. I live in Brussels. I'm from Finland. The advantage of Europe is that we have or European Union, let's say, is that we have 27 different countries who each have their own educational system, or sometimes a few different educational systems. So we see a lot of differences in those systems. Some are very centralized, others are very decentralized. Also, the level of decision-making, is the decision-taking at the, let's say, governmental level, or is it at the school district level, or all the way the classroom, that the teacher is empowered to make their own decisions, how to deliver, for example, lessons and how to plan things. So the variety is great, but also what makes it very hard for us as a sort of researchers or people who try to help teachers or policymakers is that we can't compare the systems easily. There are so many different variables that we can't really factor out these effects on that. So what we see a lot in Europe also, like here, is very innovative school projects. And they are great how they use, for example, new technologies and so on. But these are like isolated pockets of innovation. And it's great, but it doesn't help us anymore. This has been happening for 10, 15 years now, and we just don't see that spread. And if we think how people are infected with the virus, like swine flu, you need to have certain people around you who are vulnerable to get that infection. So in the same way, we need in schools and around schools, people around who are vulnerable to get that infection. So when I speak to teachers, I actually show them these social graphs, social networks created through our informal learning network, what we call it. It's a big project in Europe called eTwinning. We have currently more than 800,000 teachers signed up, and they do little school projects with other teachers. And through these projects, they get to actually
see also their own educational system and situation in their own school from distance, because they have to discuss how do we plan this project, and they get to see like, oh, actually in that school or that country, they have very different conditions, and they start appreciating in a way also their own environment. Even Finland, I come from Finland, the best piece of OECD achievement was there in math and reading comprehension, but teachers are not happy. You go to a school, they complain. But once they get to talk to other teachers in other countries and see how actually well off they are, they see it differently. It is really amazing to see that happening. So through this project, we create informal learning networks. We hope that people get in contact and get virus. So that virus would be the good innovative use of ICT, new pedagogical scenarios and all that. And how do we keep this going? And how do we make sure that policymakers give possibilities to those teachers to continue doing that? We are currently working with this idea of future scenarios. If this is the learning network, what happens in 10 or 20 years' time if we have policies going this way or that way? And then we can have sort of different scenarios with pink goggles on. This is the bright future where we have a lot of rewards and incentives in a whole educational ecology. And then the bad scenarios where things go down and there's no spread of virus, so to say. So I don't have a reward, I don't have an X prize on that yet, but it could be the future tool that you could just see pink futures and black futures and think, really not this moment, not next year, but ahead of time.
I'm interested in what I've been hearing about pockets of innovation that actually have worked. And I have been in the field of education for too long, maybe, and that I have over the years written and been awarded a number of federal grants and so on. So there have been incentives to do things with schools. And one of the problems that I have found throughout all of those years is that the feds and other funders want to fund innovation, but they really never want to fund the continuation of what works. So we end up with an innovative program somewhere. It's wildly successful, let's just say, and then the funding is gone, and you can't find anybody else to fund it because it's no longer an innovation. It's something that already worked, and your state should have picked it up. If it worked, your state should start funding it, or your local district should start funding it, and so on. And what I have found over and over and over again, and of course you get real cynical after a while about that, is that you do something that works, the pocket of innovation, whatever, and then it's over, and you can't find anyone to continue that funding. And you would think things would, once things worked, you would think they would just keep going on their own. But the fact is, they do continue to need a stream of funding. And so you have this cyclical thing going on where you have teachers get real fired up, they do something really great, and then it's over, and they feel that happens to them so many times that after a while something new comes along and it's, oh, forget that, that'll pass, and it's kind of an unhappy situation in education.
Picking up on that and what you were just talking about the viral spread, one of the thoughts that was coming to me was something that Hal Plotkin talked about yesterday, which was finding dance partners. And so where are things happening and who else is interested in that happening? So that's a kind of spread where it's not dependent on we do this, we look here for this, but it's finding the people who are interested in the same idea. And watching the plays last night, there were such similar ideas and strains of things, and you go, boy, a lot of people are thinking this. So in a kind of grassroots, viral kind of way, how can that happen? So we begin to conceive of the possibilities of doing things that, everybody is thinking. And, that's also picking up on what you were talking about, and also the peer-to-peer, university thing, where, and actually that's a kind of wonderful story, because literally she was on a trip and met some guy, and, two of them were talking, and one of them got arrested for dope, for having dope, and so they were at the police station for a long time, began having a conversation. Do you know what I mean? That really is how it started. And then a year later met someone, and that, do you know? No, I mean, but it's just interesting just in terms of the things that are going on. So it wasn't even as organized as 5 people met at a conference. It was a little more ragtag than that. And so the reason I bring that up is there's sort of a convergence of right ideas that are going on. And if we even break out of more traditional molds of thinking how we fund those things, there may be very interesting things already with the possibilities, especially with a lot of open access. You got it.
So I'm going to try this one without falling off stage. I just wanted to add a caveat to the whole thing. I mean, we talk a lot about innovation, and we talk about teaching and learning, but you have to understand that there is not a linear correlation between cause and effect in education, right? There isn't. And so what happens is you get people who are in the classroom doing their job who've got their fingers in the hole. And, they need to be your partners in innovation because they know things you'll never learn until you talk to them. Somebody asked me last night, why are teachers jaded about PhDs coming in to do research? Because the first question they're going to ask you if you come into the building is, how long did you teach? And if you say I didn't, they're not listening, because that nonlinear relationship they understand kind of intuitively from years of being in the classroom. So I guess from a knowledge management standpoint, there is a tacit knowledge that's there that hasn't been codified yet, right? And it could be very detrimental to come in and say, oh, I've got this killer app, and if you implement it, your kids are gonna blah, 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 and you're gonna kill something, and the whole thing could fall apart. So it's just a caveat. I mean, I just wanted to make sure we start thinking about that, because it's a system, And I was thinking, World of Warcraft, there's these people right now doing this thing about student engagement in World of Warcraft. It's a group of teachers who are online, and what are they gonna learn? I don't know, but we don't wanna kill the teaching, because you're always gonna need teachers. There's never gonna be a smart system that can teach, so.
I'm wondering if we can talk about dancing partners, sustainability with partners, and of course the whole idea about the community partnership, which is a much bigger circle. So, dancing partners, sometimes not difficult to find, but like I said, we do not want one-night stands. How we can do this fair weather friend to marriage till us part, or death till us part. So that has to come to the whole idea about sustainability and commitment, and the commitment only can come when there's mutual benefits. Okay, so it's just not one way that you help the school, but what do you get out of it? Otherwise, it will not sustain. Now, then you get into possible idea about community, because let's say we define a community of 4 square miles around the school, okay, with whatever agencies, even the barber shop, even, those ice cream truck, what have you. And if the feds or whomever, Generous Gates Foundation, are you still there, Gates Foundation? Okay, something like that, okay, is trust that we have the knowledge, right, to pull it off. That you say, wait, okay, if you can build, let's say we all come together and say, okay, we want to have this learning studio. We talk about learning studio, it's one of the projects. And I have not delivered yet. However, trust that we can pull it off, okay? So we build this learning studio where it's not just dancing partners, it is death do us part, because you are in that community. You don't come from outside and quote, do it to me, or vice versa. I provide the number of slots for you to check off for Gates Foundation either. Okay, so if building this learning studio where, open source, even put a bookstore, a coffee house, a theater for the arts, and make it for profit. eventually. Because that's the only way to sustain, okay? We can't keep saying that we're always nonprofit. Yeah, it's still nonprofit, but you got to make some investment. You got to generate some income. You have to. We're not living in that world that nonprofits make money too. You have to. How are you going to sustain? You ask Lisa. Don't tell me she didn't have an income, right? She got to have income. So income is to sustain, basically. So everybody will pull together, real focus on common benefits, common sustainability within a 4-mile radius, and we generate, won't pay Gates back, but that's the startup seed money, but we generate to a point that we can sustain, and it becomes, a profitable endeavor in terms of knowledge.
You're from Finland. Actually, I went to the Race to the Top assessment program meeting in Boston. I don't know if anybody else went to any of those Race to the Top assessment program meetings that were very interesting because, of course, Finland is the top scoring nation, but Alberta, Canada is the number 2. And one of the things that the person from Alberta talked about is that he said to me, in the United States, we probably beat ourselves up too much because the top scoring nations and provinces and so on don't have the kind of diversity in their population. They don't have the immigration. They don't have the poverty. And a lot of the things that we have in this country, particularly along the east and west coasts and bordering Mexico and so on, that if you were just to look at the central part of the United States and you could pull that out, you would in fact have test scores on NAEP and so on that would be equivalent to some of those top scoring nations. So we're dealing with a lot of problems in this country, and in general, I think we're actually doing very well in light of some of those problems. So I think we have a tendency to be a little too hard on ourselves.
Can I just quick really reply to your one comment about Finnish educational system. The difference is that we don't want to have high achieving, well, I wouldn't say we don't want to have high achieving students, but we are not focusing on that. That's really something that the education system is not designed to do. The main goal is to have equal opportunities. And we don't actually have, if you look at the schools, in the US, normally you see that there's the top achieving schools, and they have very small percentage of student population, and then you have the drop. And when you take the average of that, of course, it stays kind of a low. Whereas if you look at the Finland chart, you don't have those top achieving students, but everybody has been brought to the same level. And if you think of the impact of that for the whole society, it is better to have everybody having the same knowledge or rather prosperous than having to have very rich and smart people who would achieve well anyway, but who have to build those high walls around them to separate them from other people. So that's also, I think for me that's one of the main differences, but that's very fundamental, and it's very about the all values in the society. So that's makes one more hard factor to compare educational systems.
Hi, I am from Mexico, and I understand we are in the last position in this OECD test. I just recently moved to the rural area, getting away from the heat in Hermosillo, and I met this kid that is 15 years old, which is the age that they take these tests. And he doesn't want to go to school anymore, but he knows almost everything to be where he lives, like riding a horse and winning a horse race, like with a rope, getting a cow and getting milk, getting early, building a house, everything. And I told him that if we bring all these kids, 15-year-old from all over the world, to his place to raise horses and milk cows, what he thought if he was going to win or not. And he told me that he was going to win without any doubt. So I would like to invite people from Finland and Alberta, Canada, to come to this place in Mexico, bring some kids and get them together, and maybe we will find out how we can teach each other many things.
That's marvelous. Thank you. And for me, it's a great segue into, I kind of want to drop a bomb here because I think there's an elephant in this room that I haven't heard talked about at all. And that's a larger systemic community problem that we have totally marginalized our preteens and teenagers. There's no role at all for them in our society. They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to contribute. Their contributions are considered meaningless, child's play, or schoolwork. It's all an exercise. Their lives are on hold. You've heard lots of parents, when their kids sort of approach teenagehood, say, God, I wish I could just put them in the deep freeze until they reached 18. I think in order to really make education work, we've got to make our communities work. We've got to have a place for our young people. We've got to have a meaningful role for them. They have to feel that they're valued members of a community. We wonder why gangs are so strong. It's because those gangs need those members for the functions that they're doing. They form a society, they form a family, there's a role, there's a welcome. And until we can, in a larger community way, make our schools and our education system welcome and value the personal, individual contribution of every person that's participating, instead of serving as a warehousing service to keep them out of all the meaningful activity of the community until they get to be older. I don't think we're going to succeed.
So just to respond to that, what I see is a need, to keep with this conversation, the challenge. The challenge is to design a prize or an incentive that would actually motivate that to happen. I think that's a great idea. I think this whole issue of assessment is also an issue that I think is, I'll just say personally, and this is kind of, I'm just sort of being extreme because it's, we've been here for a few days and we all know each other now. But, I think assessment is just broken. And I think that is one of the places now where there's just some amazing potential to actually begin to develop some new forms of what we mean by assessment. And, I did my postdoc at Educational Testing Service, so I know a little bit about an assessment. I think assessment is broken, and I think that we have to completely rethink what we mean by it, how we measure it, what it equals. I'm thinking of your example in Mexico. I think we need a prize to completely develop what we mean by how we measure learning, right? And if learning is the outcome for citizenship, for productivity, right? That's where I think we could take, we know so much, we have so much expertise. Let's like put some people in a room and, we don't let them out. But, what is that prize that we could get to give to be really kind of that kick in the pants? To say, enough's enough. We know that testing is big business. We know, as, Myra said, that testing is by and large cheap, compared to other types of, quote unquote reforms. So, let's just kind of put our money where our mouth is and actually really try to crack that net. I would really like to see some kind of a major prize around that.
I talk to a lot of people for a living, and I tell this story all the time, so now I'm going to tell it to you. So what I do, my day job, is I do open source community development for Red Hat. That's what I do. I go out and find people who are willing to help us build, in a community setting, software that ends up being used by everyone in the world, right? Investment banks use the stuff that our community build. So specifically, I work in a community called the Fedora community. We create the Fedora operating system that becomes Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And it's made by a few hundred Red Hat employees and about 10,000 community volunteers. And it's pretty chaotic, right? That's a lot of work to do and a lot of hands to do it. So one of the tools we use is a wiki, right? The wiki at fedoraproject.org. We started probably 5 or 6 years ago with a wiki that was a poor technical choice. And after a couple of years of struggling with this wiki, one of the members of our community, Ricky, decided that he'd had enough. And so he stood up an instance of MediaWiki, which is the software that runs Wikipedia. And he started writing scripts to port content from our old wiki to our new wiki. And at first he did this entirely on his own, with no help. And he got to a certain point where he had something to show people and say, look, this is the direction I'm going. I'm not there yet, but I think this is the direction we need to go, and this is how I'll prove it. And a bunch of people jumped in and said, that's awesome, this works really well. It completely screwed up my 10 pages, but that's okay. If you fix this, that will be all good, right? And so a few people got on board the effort, including a couple of Red Hat employees. And so we were having a conference, which we have a couple of times a year, that I actually just flew in from Toronto earlier this week, the Fedora User and Developers Conference. And I sent a note to Ricky and said, we want you at FudCon so that we can get together in real time and finish the work that you've started. And he said, outstanding. So the conference came along, and he showed up bright and early with his mom, because Ricky was 16 years old. And I didn't know that Ricky was 16 until that moment, right? And that is not the only time that's happened. I can tell that exact same story with literally a dozen different kids. And one of those kids, I didn't even know his real name because legally he couldn't tell me until he turned 13. And he was smart enough not only to do work that made him appear online as the equivalent of a 20-year-old veteran of industry, but he was also savvy enough to understand that it was illegal for him and that he would be endangering us by telling us who he was. So then his 13th birthday comes and he says, my name's Luke Ferrio and I'm 13. And I naturally thought that he was a spook for the government until that point, right? So the point I'm trying to make is this. Kids have so much more capacity than we ask them to use, right? They really, really do. And I depend on their capacity to do my job every day, right? And if there's a prize that I could see, it's how do we really give kids the ability to step up and take responsibility that is meaningful? Because I see them doing it, and I want to see them doing it more.
We have time for a couple more comments, but I just want to make a quick announcement before I hand the microphone over to you, which is that we've slightly shifted the schedule to accommodate people who are trying to leave earlier than we had hoped, because we wanted the mayor to see us here, because I think it's going to be very interesting and is looking forward to talking with us. So instead of waiting the half hour, he's actually going to come speak. We're just gonna, when we finish, we'll do a couple more minutes here, and then we're just going to do some quick change with the podium, and he's going to actually talk. And then if you can stay for lunch, we would love for you to continue to join us for lunch. And so we'll probably be ending a little bit early, but I just want you to know. So anybody else who has some closing comments up here, now's your time to come up to the stage.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to try to link my thoughts into three main areas. First, when Lisa mentioned that she'd like to see an X Prize and for measuring learning, I was thinking that if what we're ultimately trying to do is create mutually beneficial partnerships, if we have a prize that only measures learning, that's only one half of the partnership. So we also need a prize that shows how to measure the effect of the partnership on the community. Because measuring, for example, I work at Arizona State University, measuring how Arizona State University is influencing the community is actually extremely complicated. Because if ASU is a partnership with a school and we go in and we tutor, we can't take credit for the increase in the test scores. There are so many different variables going on. So there's a need for looking at how to assess these partnerships that goes beyond just, oh, look, our students are learning, meaning our ASU students are learning how to be better teachers because they're in these schools. We also need to look at the effect on the community, so we need that. One way that we might see that is with President Obama had the idea of replicating the Harlem Children's Zone in 20 different cities across the US. And so right now he wants there to be a budget line in the Department of Education to replicate these promised neighborhoods. But if these promised neighborhoods are replicated, these very outcomes-based metrics that I'm talking about that look at both the learning side and the community side will be really important to create. The third point I wanted to say is if this Promised Neighborhood program does come together and cities across the nation are looking to become promised neighborhoods that are coalitions of nonprofits and schools and for-profit agencies building cradle-to-college programs, I'm very concerned with what happens with the cities who lose. So if there are 20 cities that ultimately win, I'd like to see other foundations step in and support the other innovative cities who aren't getting the federal money with private sector money.
Something's just become clear to me. It may have been perfectly obvious to all of you here, but I guess I've had something of an epiphany just now from your story, but many of the other things, what Yvonne was saying. We're still in the mode of, I think, therefore I am. Thank you, Descartes. And really, it's now, I belong, therefore I am. Yeah, and I'm not the first person to say that, I hasten to add. Right. But the implication is that the unit of analysis is now not the individual student anymore. It's the group, the community, the cohort. That's the unit of analysis we might want to be thinking about. Because it's from that group, that local group, not some national abstraction. And I come from the UK, where we have the highest, most oppressive national curriculum, league table stuff happening. It's from the local group, which has that local authenticity, where you get your identity, your reputation, the validation, your meaning. And so this enlargement of the unit of analysis from the individual student to the group tackles way more than just can this person read, write, and do science. It's about all the other things that, the fragmentation that we have in society, the fact that, the shopkeeper is not just somebody who sells me stuff, but might be somebody I could learn from, all the other good stuff about community. But I'm leaving with this new thing about what the unit of analysis is that we should be thinking about.